USS Houston was the 7th American heavy cruiser to be ordered, although chronologically she was the 4th to be laid down, part of the Northampton class, which were themselves the 2nd United States Navy heavy cruiser class. With that said, the distinction between the 8-inch heavy and the 6-inch light cruisers was still a couple of years away officially when she started construction on the 1st of May 1928. For the technical aspects of the class, you can see the video on the class itself, but in short, the easiest way to distinguish them from the preceding Pensacola class was to look at the turrets. Like her sisters, Houston carried 3 triple 8-inch turrets, as opposed to 4 turrets of their predecessors, which were also mixed with a twin and a triple at each end. Having spent almost 3.5 years on order, she practically flew down the slipway, launching in early September 1929, a year and a third after the keel was laid, and commissioning into the fleet about 9 months later in June 1930. Built at Newport News in Virginia, she spent the rest of 1930 in the Atlantic, which included a stopover in Texas to visit the city that she was named after, before heading to the Pacific Ocean, which is where she'd spend almost all of the rest of her life. Her first 2 years would, somewhat ironically, mimic the last 2, eyeing up the Imperial Japanese Navy. In this case, because the latest season of the Sino-Japanese War had opened in 1939 with the Manchuria incident. So, after a few months getting to know her new station in Manila, Houston was to be found protecting US interests in mainland China itself. And here she would remain for the most part for about 2 years, until her sister ship USS Augusta took over the job, releasing Houston to join the Scouting Force, the element of the US fleet assigned to protect the carriers, and, shockingly enough, given the name, scout for the enemy. This allowed the ship to utilise its almost 33-knot top speed considerably more than an assignment to the Battle Force would have, the Battle Force being the other half of the main fleet, where riding escort on the 21-knot standard class was usually about the most exciting thing that was going to happen to you. Her only forays east of the Panama Canal during this time were for the occasional fleet problem and a couple of presidential ferry missions. This would include the last big fleet problem prior to World War II, Fleet Problem 20, in early 1939. Following this, and an overhaul that took her until the end of the year, she was sent back to the Philippines as the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, with the additional weight of some extra 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns to notionally help protect the ship a bit better. She would survive the initial Japanese assault on Cavite by the clever expedient of not being there, having sailed shortly after word of the Pearl Harbor attacks was received, and fetching up a couple of weeks later in Australia, having taken a somewhat less obvious but longer route, in part to avoid any submarine ambushes that the Japanese Navy might have set on the more direct and obvious lines of travel. After a short while there, she was assigned to ABDA Command as its most powerful surface asset, and indeed one of the only 2 ships that were actually armed with 8-inch guns, the other being the 6-gun HMS Exeter. Her first taste of major action would be in the Battle of the Flores Sea, also known as the Battle of Makassar Strait, where she joined the cruiser USS Marblehead and Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Tromp, along with 7 US and Dutch destroyers in an attempt to destroy a Japanese invasion convoy that was protected by a roughly comparable escort group. However, this attempted attack was driven off before any surface action could be engaged in by Japanese bombers that first damaged the Marblehead and then landed a hit on Houston that knocked out her aft turret, rendering her only able to use 6 of her 9 guns. After a convoy escort mission in which she proved quite adept, even with her limited anti-aircraft armament, at fending off further attacks, I guess that first bomb strike had given them some more incentive, Houston rejoined the Dutch cruisers from her previous mission, along with the cruiser HMAS Perth and HMS Exeter, plus 10 destroyers, and then sailed for the Battle of the Java Sea. Albeit this mission was another attempt at taking out a Japanese invasion convoy, and not actually a deliberate attempt to engage Japanese Navy surface forces in battle. At the upper end of things, the 2 Allied heavy cruisers, each now with 6 operational guns, had to face off against a 10-gun Miyoko-class heavy cruiser each. This, and the rest of the battle, didn't end particularly well, with both Dutch cruisers being sunk, Exeter being damaged, and 3 destroyers also being sunk. Houston escaped major damage, along with Perth, but the following night they ran into another Japanese formation, which included 2 Mogami-class heavy cruisers. But it wasn't to be gunfire that would spell Houston's end. As she and Perth tried to force their way through the Japanese destroyer line, hitting both destroyers and the cruiser Mikuma, she was in turn hit by gunfire, but more critically, by 4 torpedoes. As the ship began to roll over, the crew began to abandon ship, but they were machine gunned by circling Japanese destroyers, and as a result, out of the just over 1,000 men aboard, only about a third would survive the night, and another 77 of those would die in the hellish conditions of Japanese prisoner of war camps. A Cleveland-class cruiser would be renamed whilst on the stocks in her honour, although the name would thereafter lapse when that cruiser was decommissioned in the late 1940s until it was picked up again in the 1980s by a nuclear-powered attack sub. In 2014, the wreck of the Houston was officially discovered, mostly in one piece, but upside down, although both before and after the official discovery it appears that she has unfortunately been subject to the grave robbing common to many World War II wrecks in the area, albeit that it's not quite to the same extent as some others, which have unfortunately been almost totally destroyed.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.